In the winter of 1842, 16,000 British Indian troops and their camp followers marched into the freezing mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. Only one British doctor made it out alive. It was a massacre at the hands of local tribesmen, cementing the region's lethal reputation as the graveyard of empires. A century later, as the United States and the Soviet Union carved up the globe during the Cold War, the Kingdom of Afghanistan kept its distance. Officially neutral, the country accepted economic aid from both sides while keeping its own borders quiet. That quiet shattered in the 1970s. Prime Minister Dawood Khan seized power from the king and began funding proxy rebel groups across the border in neighboring Pakistan. Pakistan retaliated by backing Afghan Islamist factions, and by 1978 the internal friction reached a breaking point. Soviet-trained Afghan military officers assassinated Khan and installed the Marxist People's Democratic Party. This new regime forced Soviet-style modernizations on a traditional rural population. Across the countryside, local militias and religious leaders took up arms. Fearing the collapse of their new socialist ally, Moscow intervened. In December 1979, the Red Army rolled across the border. 80,000 Soviet troops, backed by heavy artillery and armored divisions, occupied Kabul, executed the erratic Afghan president, and replaced him with a more compliant leader. Moscow thought they were conducting a brief stabilization mission. Instead, they poured gasoline on a regional fire. The arrival of a foreign superpower turned scattered rural uprisings into a massive, organized resistance, triggering 4 continuous decades of warfare. The Red Army fought the only way it knew how, with overwhelming conventional force. Soviet commanders sent heavy tank columns into narrow mountain passes and relied on attack helicopters to flatten rural villages suspected of harboring rebels, driving civilians from their homes. The survivors of those bombings organized. Operating in independent regional factions rather than a single unified army, these fighters called themselves the Mujahideen. They viewed the conflict as a holy war against an occupying atheist power, relying on their knowledge of the brutal terrain to ambush Soviet patrols. Washington saw an opportunity to trap the Soviets in their own Vietnam. The CIA launched Operation Storm, partnering with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan's intelligence services to quietly pump billions of dollars and surplus weapons directly into the hands of the Mujahideen. The introduction of FIM-92 Stingers stripped away Soviet air superiority. These heat-seeking, shoulder-fired missiles allowed rebels hiding in the mountains to down Russian gunships with a single shot. Moscow could no longer protect its supply lines from the air. Up to 2 million Afghans were dead, but the Soviets were losing thousands of young men and bleeding their treasury dry during severe economic stagnation. Recognizing the futility, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev ordered a complete withdrawal in February 1989. The armored columns rolled back north, leaving behind a ruined country filled with highly trained, heavily armed militias. The Red Army proved that conventional military tactics were ineffective against a determined, decentralized guerrilla force. With the common enemy gone, the rebel alliance fractured. International superpowers and foreign backers closed their wallets, and Afghanistan collapsed into a vicious civil war. Rival factions shelled the capital of Kabul, fighting block by block for control over the ashes. Out of this lawlessness, a new faction emerged from the southern religious schools, the Taliban. Promising order, they quickly conquered most of the country by 1996. They enforced a severe interpretation of Islamic law and opened their borders to foreign militant volunteers looking for a safe harbor. One of those volunteers was a wealthy Saudi who had fought the Soviets in the 80s, Osama bin Laden. Using the protection of the Taliban government, he built a sprawling network of training camps. The battle-tested tactics once used against a superpower were now weaponized for international terrorism. On September 11, 2001, terrorists trained in those Afghan camps hijacked 4 passenger planes, killing nearly 3,000 Americans. When the Taliban refused to hand over the architects of the attack, the United States and Britain launched a massive, coordinated air and ground invasion to tear down the regime. The opening retaliation was swift. Supported by airstrikes, opposition militias broke the Taliban in weeks. But during intense bombing campaigns in the Tora Bora cave complexes, the top leaders of both the Taliban and al-Qaeda quietly slipped across the mountainous border into Pakistan. Washington won the opening battle, but the enemy had simply retreated to the mountains to regroup. Armed with stealth bombers and laser-guided munitions, the United States walked into the exact geographical trap that broke the Red Army 20 years earlier. As the U.S. and its NATO allies attempted to build a new central government, the Taliban carefully assessed their powerful enemy. They knew any direct firefight against coalition troops would end instantly under a wave of precision drone strikes and coordinated artillery. So they adapted. They buried artillery shells under dirt roads and wired them to cheap radios and wooden planks. These improvised explosive devices allowed the insurgency to bleed the world's most advanced military without fighting in the open. Year after year, the coalition casualty count ticked upward. Despite billions of dollars in infrastructure projects and massive troop surges, coalition forces could secure the major cities, but the rural highways belonged to the insurgency. It was a grueling 2-decade stalemate fought over individual valleys and dirt paths. By early 2021, public support in the West had completely eroded. President Joe Biden announced a strict deadline for a withdrawal of American forces by September 11th, ending America's longest war. As the last U.S. troops packed up, the Afghan National Army shattered. The Taliban swept across the country in days, facing almost zero resistance. Hundreds of thousands of desperate civilians rushed the Kabul airport in a chaotic scramble to escape before the capital fell. Two superpowers spent trillions of dollars and thousands of lives trying to enforce their will on the region. Neither succeeded. Instead, 40 years of foreign invasions and weapons shipments served as a brutal evolutionary pressure cooker, forging an isolated resistance movement into an asymmetric fighting force capable of outlasting the world's greatest military.